Good afternoon and welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. This video is based on a recent trip to New York City, and I did this painting on location, and I thought I'd like to develop it to show you some of the things that I was thinking about while on location and then back in the studio. This is a painting where shadows play a major role. It's a scene in the West Village of New York City, and I happened upon it a few weeks ago when I was there in October. Low light and strong shadows. These are things that attracted me to the scene. The first step was to select a good location that had a dramatic view and one where I could stand comfortably. So these are things that I consider when I'm looking for a good location. This opened up and gave me the sort of view that I wanted to use. The next thing is to start to think about how to do this painting. I know that I wanted a big graded wash in the painting, but I did a pretty serious drawing beforehand, especially around the area of the truck, to give myself an area to avoid when I'm doing that wash. So the lines are a little darker. You can see where I placed the truck, and you can see the lines also that I've drawn to indicate the angles of shadows. This is important because as the painting progresses, the light moves across the scene, and I wanted to record those angles before I started painting. Well, this first wash is an important one because in this wash I sort of set the stage for the angle of light that I'm trying to depict. I have my paper tilted at about 40 degrees. I'm using a large mop brush and trying to paint the facade of the buildings all in one go. And I'm trying to control the wash so that I get a graded feel to it. In other words, it's very light near the top. As it comes down lower in the painting, I'm adding darker, thicker, richer color to create the feeling of a graded wash. This graded wash aids me, helps to create the effect that light is raking over the buildings and creating and is a strong low light. I'm using 140-pound Arches watercolor paper with a rough surface. This is important to me, especially when I start to place dry brush near the end of the painting. I want there to be some texture and a broken effect to the edges that I'm creating. And so using a rough paper helps me to do that. My palette is pretty simple. I'm using a few warm colors: yellow ochre, cadmium yellow light, some burnt sienna, using some ultramarine blue, and some neutral tint. I use the neutral tint to create the green that I use in some of the foliage. And as well, I use it to create some very strong shadows where I want them underneath the vehicles. Well, we're coming to the end of this wash, and this wash kind of sets the high notes, the bright spots of the painting. It also delineates the truck, which is something that I want to do. I want to use the white of the paper as much as possible through that area. Gives me a good shape in the puddle below. And as it dries, the graded effect will materialize, and it'll be more prominent towards the end of the painting after I've placed shadows and darker colors across the surface of the buildings. So I let the paper dry before moving on to the next step, which I want to approach the foliage on the right-hand side that's casting some really beautiful shadows down and to the left. I start with cadmium yellow light, pretty thick, and I throw it on with the brush. I'm throwing it a bit at an angle and getting some splatter and a very irregular quality to the shape. And I drag a darker hue down the side of the buildings to create the illusion of shadows. And while that wash is still wet, I introduce some strong darks underneath the foliage to push it forward So in this one small corner, there's a lot going on. I will return to this area and paint into it after it dries as well, but it's important for the effect or for the quality that I want to do this while the paint is wet, to add the foliage and then draw it down and create shadows. I do the same thing up above with I'm using a sablette brush here because it gives me a nice firm feel to it, a bouncy quality. It's smaller than a mop and gives me that sort of calligraphic effect that I love in paintings. So I go back and forth between the mop brush and then this sablette brush, which is not an expensive brush at all, but has a quality to it. If you're curious more about the materials I'm using, especially types of brushes and types of paper or paint, at the description that's at the bottom of this video, I have a link to my materials list, so you can see everything there. Well, that section is nearly complete. And I'm going for one of the more important passages in the painting right now. It's a big awning that hangs over the sidewalk, and I believe it's some sort of dance studio. In any case, it's an important feature to the painting because it really pushes back against the surface of the wall. It casts a beautiful shadow down the side of the wall. It's an opportunity for some brighter, stronger color. And I'm trying to paint it as a beautiful shape, regardless of what any of these things are, whether they're buildings or moldings or windows or shadows. I'm trying to create a beautiful shape as well as a feeling of calligraphy in the brushwork that I'm using to create these shapes. So I hope you can see that in the way that I'm handling the brush and being very brief with the brushwork. This culminates, I think, anyway, it leads to a feeling of the work being done very quickly and with a lot of joy and emotion. And the calligraphy the calligraphic effect is very important to me, so I work hard to concentrate and plan the stroke before I make it and really focus on the calligraphic aspect to it. And that also means not going back and adjusting the mark too much once I've made it. You'll also notice that as I'm painting these shadows, they're getting darker and richer as they come forward in the painting. This helps to create a feeling of depth and a feeling of drama. While I'm painting this shadow, I'm painting it all as one shape, even though it's many different shadows. I'm trying to create a shape that reads as one major shape. And while it's still wet, you can notice that the paper is shiny. I can continue to add or remove color to adjust it to the sort of quality that I want. For example, while this awning is still wet, I'm introducing a strong cadmium red. And that cadmium red is going to be picked up elsewhere in the painting, but it also makes this sign feel a little more prominent and a little more, of course, colorful. Also, I think you're starting to appreciate, as we near this stage in the painting, how the darks are connected. These are rather dark passages on the light wall surrounding the truck from the right side of the painting all the way to the left side. Of course, the shape is interrupted and broken up, but largely the darks are connected. And the result of this is a sort of visual integrity. It makes the painting feel stronger. It gives a sort of cohesion to the small parts of the painting, makes it more of a unified expression. And sometimes it presents itself this way in nature, but more often than not, you have to conjure or invent a means to kind of create these, to unify these dark passages. So here's a tricky part of the painting where I'm still trying to be calligraphic and very brief with the marks, but we're painting an object, this truck that has a high degree of detail, and as an object it's a little difficult to paint. So I've drawn it with a little more precision than I usually use, and following those marks, but at the same time trying to introduce a few flourishes with the brush to make it feel a little more interesting. And I continue that adding darks while this paint is wet. You may not have noticed, may not notice it on your screen, but I've added some very strong neutral tint under the vehicle, neutral tint being sort of a black color. And as it dries, that will become more obvious that there's a dark within the dark. And adding it while it's wet gives me a soft edge, makes it a little more subtle, of a subtle effect. And so in this case, I'm observant of the timing, the state of the wash, so that if it is wet, I can do these sorts of things. Once it dries off, I can add dry brush and other elements, but I can't really affect the big wash that I'm creating now. It was lucky for me when I was painting in New York City that this truck remained in place for a long time. So I had a good opportunity to observe it, to draw it, to understand its relationship to the curb and figures that are moving by it. That's not always the case. Sometimes we have to we're working on an object like this and it suddenly moves away, and we're kind of left guessing how to finish it. So in that respect, it's a good idea to make your drawing the first priority. Take a couple photographs in case things move. And certainly the angle of the shadows was recorded in the drawing and allowed me to, well, it prevented me from following the shadows and being too influenced by how they move across the surface of the house. I'm sorry, of the buildings. Well, I continue to add elements to the facade of these buildings. And as you notice, the constantly connecting different passages to make it sort of a unified expression or even a unified shape. One awning and one shadow feels like the extension of another. I like that quality. I'm varying the color, adding a bit more yellow to this awning just for variety. However, the palette remains, as is in the case of most of my work, a very limited palette. And in this case, I pick up on the mother color, if you will, of this painting, which is definitely that ochre color, that warm hue that's on the road and on the side of the buildings. And this was a color that kind of enters into all the mixtures that I'm using. Now I'm moving down to place the shadow that's cast across the road. I'm going with a bit more blue in this shadow, still a very rather warm gray, and while it's dark, it's going to dry a bit lighter, and that yellow tone that was painted initially, that warm color, is going to come out a little more. I used this shadow. This shadow, of course, was in my line of sight, but I'm exaggerating it a little bit, pushing it closer to the truck to give me a more interesting entry to the painting and to bring the focus a little more strongly to bear on the vehicle and the worker standing by the vehicle. It's also giving me an opportunity to paint these shapes of puddles with a little more positive idea. They're white now. I'm using the white of the paper now, but later on I intend to alter them with some colors. And an interesting passage here, I'm softening the top edge of that shadow. Just a little bit of a soft edge makes it more of a gentle entrance into the painting. We feel like that graded aspect to the edge of the wash allows us to travel over the road, our eyes to travel over the road and find our main subject, my main subject being this truck making its delivery. Well, it's starting to look rather finished. I've got some more windows to add. You can tell when I place the windows into the shadow, as I am on the right side of this painting, they make the shadows start to feel more transparent. So not only are they describing the front of the building, as they should, but they're also helping to make areas that are in shadow, make those shadows feel transparent. Same time, I can reinforce this idea of a direct light coming overhead by working back into the shadow. The little accent of stronger color, that combination works to create a direction to the light, makes the light feel more overhead than if I had just left them a simple shape. And now that we've placed some windows into those shadows, you can start to feel they're a little more transparent. We'll continue this idea. The paper's completely dry. As we work across the painting and down through the facade of the buildings where we have some storefronts, we have some ledges and moldings in the building, we have other decorative features. I guess a tricky point is, where do you draw the line? Where do you say enough is enough and we don't need any more of this right now? We can either call the painting finished or do an adjustment elsewhere. That's a tricky part, and there's no one right answer. I like to, when I'm on location especially, I like to stop the painting with something to do. Like I know, for example, that if I add some color to the puddle, that it's going to make it a better result. If I add some of that red coming from overhead to the puddle, it's going to make the painting a little better. And I'll leave that to do back in the studio. This is one way I prevent myself from going overboard and making too many adjustments. Well, I'm using the dry brush really thoroughly now in a lot of places to finish off complex areas like that storefront that's in the front, finish off some of the detail areas of windows in the background, finish off the vehicles that are behind the main truck. Small brush, and look how I'm holding the brush here. A little differently than when I was adding big washes. I'm resting my hand on the paper, and I'm using a smaller brush and holding it down near the end. This gives me a lot more control over those small passages. As it's drying, look at the first wash that we applied, that graded wash in the buildings, and look at how it's shining up above and in the middle, almost like a bit of glare coming off the building. This was the result of a graded wash, a wash that was paler on the top and grew darker as it came down to meet the truck. And this combines with those strokes describing the angle of the shadows to create a feeling of strong and angled light upon the subject. The sky was blue, but I'm painting a yellow sky. I'm keeping to my theme of basically a warm painting, to carry that idea of sunlight. And I am using a variety of warm colors, just a few cool greens in the shadows back to the right, but mostly warm colors. And when I'm painting a sunny scene, I tend to rely on the warmer side of the palette. Now, after placing a little bit of water in the puddles just to make them wet, I return with a small brush and a little bit of cad red light to allude to the color that's above, whether it's the awning, a figure, a shadow. I want to kind of reflect the white aspect of the truck as well. So these become sort of a reinforcement of what's painted above, and at the same time give us a little feeling like rain had passed the evening before and given us a bit of wetness on the sidewalk. And also, ideally, I think this solves the problem of maybe a foreground that is too boring. Gives us just a little bit of detail. I've added some dry brush, some texture, a feeling of a curb, and all of these things kind of culminate in an interesting shadowed area. So this is the painting, the final result of the painting, and I think you can appreciate the brushwork that went into making the shadows, the dry brush that was painted after the shadows to make the shadows feel transparent, some of the edge control in the big shadow on the ground and through the front of the truck. And well, I would go to this description, and in the description you'll see a link to a tutorial that supports this video. Talks a little bit more about things that I've mentioned while painting it, and also has some links to videos that deal with shadows as well. And I hope the information is useful to you. Thank you.